The proceeding will start shortly.
Order, and welcome to this special session of the Defra Select Committee. We're delighted to have on his first visit the Secretary of State Steve Barclay and Permanent Secretary Tamara Finkelstein, who is no stranger to this committee. How many Secretary of States have you served in your time at Defra, Tamara? How many have you served? Six. Wow. So, and I think it's very timely, actually, and we decided to give you a bit of time to settle in before we brought you in, so that you'd have no excuse for not knowing the answers to all the questions. I think it might be appropriate to draw attention to the protests that we saw in Parliament Square yesterday. We've seen protests across Europe. We've particularly seen protests in Wales, where farmers are not happy at all. And the general feeling of uncertainty and discontent, I think, amongst the industry, which no doubt will be reflected in this questioning. The first point I was going to raise with you was, and I think I raised this at Defra Questions last time, this perfect storm where we have a situation where, you know, the wheat plantings are down 15% year on year. Winter barley down 22%, and AHDB were forecasting that a 79% increase in arable fallow. Following that, I think you've taken action. Perhaps you might just start again with a little bit of a sort of resume of why you've made these changes to the maximum amount of land that can be put into some of these schemes, and maybe allay some fears among some tenant farmers who were worried that maybe their land would be taken in hand to farm very easily, just taking subsidies, or indeed a situation where some farmers might just sack all their staff and sell all their machinery and put their entire farm into stewardship.
Yeah, well, thank you, Sir Robert, and it's great to have an opportunity to be with the committee. And you're right, I think there have been concerns as to whether we got the balance right between the funding for the environment and the funding for food production and food security. And you're also right that those have particularly crystallised around tenant farmers as to whether there was a risk of landowners removing tenant farmers because they were opting to go into environmental schemes as opposed to food production. And that's why, as part of actively listening to those concerns, and particularly working with the tenant forum, and we had a meeting of that forum just last week in the department that I joined, we've looked at changing some of the SFI schemes so that where previously there were 7 years and that wasn't working for tenants, you actually shorten them so they make them more accessible, taking some of the obstacles to accessing those schemes. We've obviously at the Oxford Farming Conference increased the rates as well, an average 10% increase in there. We're looking at specific things for tenant farmers around a commissioner, a code of practice, and that sort of area. But the announcement today as part of that is to put a cap on a number of the SFI schemes where there was a risk only of a very small percentage, but nonetheless a wider concern that some farms might be put entirely into environmental schemes as opposed to food production. So we put a 25% limit on that where there is that risk. Not least because it's not often good for the environment to put 100% of land into some of those schemes. So it wasn't good environmentally, but it certainly wasn't good for food production and food security. And more widely, my focus very much is on prioritising food production and food security. So that's the wider direction of travel since being appointed that I've sought to bring, and that's reflected in the various grants that the Prime Minister announced at the NFU conference, £427 million in grants, looking at how we address some of the costs of food production, and also your point on volatility. And again, I'm very, very conscious of just how hard it's been for farmers. The flooding in particular, as you know, has been terrible this year, and that's really created challenges, as well as the fact we're in a period of transition. We're 3 years into a 7-year transition. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and what we're trying to do is reassure that we're listening, we're flexing our schemes on SFI, whether it's the average payments or the more choice with 50 more schemes, but we're also looking at how we help farmers on costs, and particularly where there's specific challenge for tenant farmers, working with the forum on the specific actions to address those concerns.
Were you concerned that the budget might be overspent if people with the number of applications? And was this based on actual applications you saw coming in or a prediction about what was likely to happen?
Well, one bit of news that I can share with the committee, which is that SFI has now had over 15,500 applications. I think the highest of any scheme that Defra has run in the past was 20,000. So at the 6-month stage, that shows just how successful so far it's been. So we're seeing more people coming forward. And what we're looking at doing is how we streamline the applications process as well to make that easier. In terms of whether there's a risk of overspends, actually I think the risk for the department has been the other way round. The department had underspends in its last 2 years. And one of the things I was very grateful to the Prime Minister for agreeing with me was I made the case when I was appointed that those underspends should go in to the department budget for 24-25. I'm pleased that the Prime Minister agreed with that submission. That means that this year the budget will be £400 million higher than it was 4 years ago. So whilst we've committed to our manifesto of 2.4 billion, because of the underspends from the last 2 years, it actually means next year there will be more than 2.4 billion going into farming. And I think that's essential given the wider volatility that the sector faces.
Understood. In terms of some of these stewardship options, the pollen and nectar, birdseed, is work being done to see what sort of would be optimal levels? I've heard people suggesting that putting a whole 20-acre field into pollen and nectar is really overkill, and similar with bird feed. There aren't enough birds to eat all. Has any work being done to try and finesse these schemes to ensure that we aren't just putting in some of these environmental options just for the sake of it, rather than to deliver any environmental goals?
Very much. That's what we've been looking at, and that's why the announcement today on the 25% cap is really directed at that. And I was struck talking to some of our environmental colleagues who said, if you take your example there, Sir Robert, of birdseed mix, actually there's a risk of greater vermin if that is done in too high a proportion. So getting the balance right is important. I think where the environmental schemes lend themselves best is those parcels of land on a farm that are less productive. Yep. It's also to those schemes such as soil quality or reducing the use of pesticide by using modern equipment, where we can do things that reduce the cost of food production but also has a benefit to the environment. And Minette Batters spoke about this at the NFU conference. She described it as two sides of the same coin, and I very much agree with that approach. I think we can orientate our environmental spend to things that help food production but is also good for the environment, and that feels like the sweet spot and is very much the focus that we're bringing.
Perhaps we're saying that there was limited evidence that people were starting to put that whole swathes of land into these options, but it was clearly a concern. So as we've been trying to do all the time, been listening and adjusting as we needed to, and we wouldn't still expect people even to be going up to that sort of 25%, although that provides an automated cap. It's likely to be at lesser levels on the sort of actions that we have put a cap on.
It was certainly being discussed in the pubs of North Yorkshire. Yeah. Could I ask a little about soil health, because we published a recent report on soil health, and thank you for your response. I think one of the main lessons we learned is how difficult it is to evaluate how some of the different ways of farming, mixed farming, using min-till, etc., how that was feeding in. I mean, are we in a better position to actually evaluate how some of these ELMS-type schemes are going to the results are going to be measurable, particularly in terms of soil and soil carbon, soil structure and soil moisture holding capacity?
Well, I think it's a really important area that the committee was exploring. And of course, in Northern Ireland, they have done a lot of work in terms of how they get better data around this with the survey they have been doing. I think it's also actually part of a wider debate, which is, under the old adage, what gets measured gets done, how are we benchmarking where things are on the environment so we can then better measure the various interventions. And I was very struck if one looks at, for example, David Thurston's report into Dartmoor, where a source of conflict between Natural England and commoners that farm on the moor has been the confusion as to what the original state of the moor was versus where on the environmental measures one is trying to get the moor to, and given the further complexity of climate change, where they're trying to take it back to a past standard on which the data is not clear, is the right measure, given that climate change may need to change what you're trying to do there with the overgrazing in some areas and the undergrazing in others. So I think the wider point around how we have better data to benchmark the various schemes is hugely important. But I think that's part of a wider conversation also about how we use data more effectively within the farming sector so that it's a less siloed approach. And actually we start to look at how we better use, when we're looking at fertilizers or pesticides, how we better use the data that we've got, how that, and who has control of that data, and making sure that farmers are the ones that have control of it.
And can you reassure farmers who are often very enthusiastic about these schemes that they will be paid for the actions that they take rather than necessarily for the outcomes which may or may not be predictable?
Well, very much. So I think the direction of travel is, for me, I was very struck by the fact that 72% of land is farmland. So when we're looking at environmental schemes, the NGOs have a very important role to play, and we have a range of schemes, landscape recovery schemes, this year's spend on habitat species restoration, the 25 million, etc. A lot of that went to NGOs. But I think it is important that we take the farming community more with us on those environmental schemes that have a benefit for food production. And I think therefore how we measure that and how we give that 72% of land that is farmed more of a role to play, I think is hugely important. And
do you think you will have enough data to be able to commit to publishing a formal ELMS evaluation at regular intervals?
Well, I think there's been... so firstly, we've got commitments already on things like food security, the 3-year review, and the commitment the Prime Minister made at the NFU conference to have the Farm to Fork Summit as an annual summit, and a food security index is all part of the greater transparency that we're bringing. I know colleagues in the NFU...
We're going to come on to food security a bit later. But,
perfect.
Yeah.
So I know more widely the NFU has talked about sort of impact assessments around the various ELM schemes. I think one of the challenges there is the numbers of applications are increasing so quickly, and we are refining those schemes all the time. And in fact, I'd like to pay tribute to the team in the department that I think has been incredibly responsive as a farming team in terms of actively listening to the sector. And if you look at the satisfaction, and PermSec may want to come on this, but I think we're now at over 80% of respondents saying 6 or more out of 10 satisfaction with SFIs, which is a marked improvement on where we were 2 years ago. So that's not to say there isn't more to do. And we're looking at how we streamline, for example, from countryside stewardship into ELMS, and how we cut some of the bureaucracy. But I think it's a tribute to colleagues in the farming team that those satisfaction has improved. Name if I were you. Well, I'm very happy to, because I think Janet Hughes has done a absolutely fantastic job, and I'm very grateful, Sir Robert, that you flagged that, because I think her and the team have really listened. And in fact, when I talk, for example, of the 10% average increase in FSI payments, what that slightly disguises is some schemes actually increase fourfold. And that was very much a response to upland farmers, for example, where the pressure on profitability was particularly acute. And I know that is something that Janet particularly and the team looked at. And again, no one is sitting here and saying there isn't more to do. We recognise there is more to do, but you can see the direction of travel, and it is one that is very much geared around profitability on farm and how we support people through the transition.
Certainly a lot of farmers are looking at the sort of forage legume option, which is very general. In fact, it looks better than actually growing field beans to sell and feed animals on, really. Is that a worry that maybe we'll be switching out of some of these less profitable crops?
I'm always worried if, Sir Robert, you say something is generous in case Treasury colleagues are listening in. I think the point is that the legumes comes back to your earlier point about soil quality. And so I think there is a role for that in terms of, yes, it does take those fields out of production for a couple of years, but it brings benefits in terms of food, in terms of soil quality. And ultimately, I think this is where the food production and the environment really comes together. It's about how do we have a sector that is more profitable. For that, we need to drive productivity. That, for me, is about reducing input costs on things like fertiliser, energy, water, and how we have a more circular farm. And that's very much the approach that we're taking.
Baroness Kate Rock did some great work on her tenant farming review. What progress have you, and you mentioned it briefly in your opening remarks, but what progress has been made by the Tenancy Farm Forum? And when will your report call for evidence on introducing the Tenant Farming Commissioner?
Yeah. So I think the Tenant Farmers Forum is a hugely important body. I was actually in number 10 when the ROC review was set up. It was something I championed in a previous role. I think Baroness Rock has done a formidable job in terms of taking those proposals forward. And I think, to be fair, there was an issue. There was a real issue there that some of the FFIs were not as responsive to tenant farmers as they needed to be, and work has been done to fix that. My expectation, I'm not in a position with the committee today to make an announcement on the Commissioner and the Code of Conduct. We have the Farm to Fork Summit coming up. The Prime Minister committed to do an annual Farm to Fork Summit.
Thank you. We call for that, and thank you very much.
You did. Another sign of the department's listening, Robert.
We also call for an annual food security report as well, which...
And we've just committed to a food security index. So I think those are two things that you as a committee have called for, that you can see have been adopted. And what I'm happy to commit to is my expectation is by the time of the Farm to Fork Summit, we will be in a position to announce where we are on the Commissioner and the Code of Conduct. But as I say, I joined the forum this week. Hopefully that shows how seriously we're taking it. And Baroness Watt was there, as was, for example, the Deputy President of the NFU, David Exwood, and the President of the CLA and others. So very senior stakeholders were involved.
And will Defra give the forum the remit to talk to the Law Commission about changing agricultural tenancies?
Well, as I say, we've set up the forum in order to discuss these issues. You will be well aware where we are in the parliamentary timetable, and the scope for primary legislation is currently very limited. But I think if I look at the recommendations from the ROC review, I think pretty much the only ones not currently happening are the ones where it requires legislative change. I think it's certainly over 80%, and it may even be over 90%. I could clarify to the committee, but from memory, it's 91. 91%. I thought so. I don't want to over-promise it. It's easier to go up. So it's 91% of the recommendations have either happened or are in train. And the ones that haven't, I think the 8.8% is due to legislation being required.
And certainly, George Jones from the Tenant Farmers Association welcomed your changes to the maximum amount set aside that can be put in, because I think there was quite a worry that some landlords might just try and take land back in to farm it very easily. So I think that many tenant farmers are quite relieved as well to hear that. Neil Hudson.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, both of you, for being before us today. I wanted to move into biosecurity, animal health and public health. First of all, Secretary of State, though, can I thank you for listening to the representations about extending the neutering deadline for the young XL bully dogs till halfway through 2025. This will have significant health benefits for those younger big dogs and also relieve a lot of the pressures and strains on the veterinary profession. So thank you very much, and the committee was fully pushing for that. Permanent Secretary, you won't be surprised that my first line of questioning will be on the APHA Weybridge. So the Animal Plant Health Agency headquarters in Weybridge in Surrey is in need of a significant radical refurbishment, and I know you and the department are full square behind that, and you told this committee that the redevelopment was essential and completely crucial to protect the country against zoonotic diseases and other things. So can I just ask, from the department's view, what progress has been made in making that case to Treasury for the funding to deliver that critical infrastructure to protect the country's biosecurity and, by implication, our national security?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we actually had a deep dive on this programme and where it is today at our executive committee, and we are making progress on what we need to do in the first instance around clearing the site and so on. The critical thing we're doing is putting together the business case for the summer, which is part of that path to Treasury engagement. I should say that a Treasury team visited the site in January, so we're continuing on that path of ensuring that they understand the criticality of that. The issue is where the funding that we ask for rates against other pieces of infrastructure. But as you know, we are absolutely clear that we need to do this work and it's critical for biosecurity.
So the current estimate was it was 2.8 billion to refurbish it. I think 1.2 billion had been allocated. So you're making the case for the additional 1.6 billion as part of that critical infrastructure. Yeah.
Very well. PermSec has been very clear to me coming into the department how important this is. So I think it is something both as an executive team but also ministerially we're being very clear is a priority, and it is something that we're very actively discussing with the centre.
Okay, thank you.
So I'll just clarify the 1.2 billion. I think 1.2 billion was a very early estimate of what the programme would be. Once the work was done, it clearly wasn't going to be that, and it's in the 2.8 billion. The money we've been allocated is for this spending review period to do some of that initial work, and then we look to further spending review periods to get the rest of it.
Can I put on record the thanks of this committee to all the staff in Defra, but specifically the people in the APHA for all they do in terms of protecting our biosecurity, and they've had a lot of challenges in recent years with avian influenza, and I know a very live issue at the moment is the blue tongue situation. I don't know if you wanted to give us just a quick update on readiness for things that could upsurge as the midge season becomes upon us.
Well, as you know, Dr. Hudson, blue tongue is a very real risk. It is something that colleagues are monitoring very closely. Lord Robbie Douglas Miller, in particular, is leading a regular series and drumbeat of meetings. There's also a roundtable with him and the Minister for Farming. I think the week before last on that. I had a meeting on it the week before. And so, as it is airborne, there's limits to what can be done in terms of prevention. There are questions as to what impact it has on livestock if one looks at the Netherlands, as to severity, which obviously we need to monitor. One of the questions is between the effective areas, how quickly then that would spread and what impact does that have on movement restrictions or not. And those are the sort of issues we're discussing with key stakeholders in terms of our response. But I can assure you that this is an issue that the department is very alive to and is one that there's a series of meetings happening on.
Okay, thank you. And moving to another issue, I mean, it's still with us. It's not to the same level, but it could come back at higher levels, is the avian influenza situation. And just in the last couple of weeks, the department has announced that all bird keepers in the UK would be required to join a register, so it wasn't a sort of certain number of birds that you have to keep. So that's a strong measure to try and help us with our control measures for diseases like avian influenza and Newcastle disease. When do you expect that legislation to be implemented in terms of flock owners, registering with this database? And how do you feel as a department it's going to help us tackle some of these diseases?
I think I'd have to write to you on the precise details of it. But we did a kind of lessons learned of the major avian influenza outbreak, and that was one of the actions that clearly would help us in managing this in future. And we've looked at a range of things that we need to do, including how we resource APHA and manage concurrent instances and so on. But that was one of the things that we thought would be helpful to do.
And another tool in the box is potentially is vaccination as well. I mean, maybe would you like to write to us with that, or do you have an update on where we're at in terms of developing that vaccination strategy in terms of avian influenza, or is that something you could follow up with? Yeah,
well, I mean, we continue to do that, and obviously we're doing it also with overseas partners, because that's important to be moving along with others, especially because of the concern is impact on being able to export and so on. So, but we could give you some further update by letter.
And another critical disease that we are fighting in this country is bovine tuberculosis. And previously, the department had announced plans to phase out the wildlife culling programme, the badger culling, and transition towards other measures by 2038. Secretary of State, you've now come in March now and announced a consultation to actually keep going and potentially extend targeted badger culling. Can you give us an idea of time frame on that consultation, and I guess give us the government's thinking on what we can do to tackle this dreadful disease? And I know that the chair of the Environment Audit Committee and I had an exchange in the chamber last week in the food security debate about the implications of bovine TB in terms of the catastrophe it happens to people's herds, but also the mental health implications for the farmers, the vets involved, everyone involved. So can you give us an update on what the government's thinking is on what we can do to control this disease?
Yep. Well, so firstly, I think it is important to recognise just how devastating it is to farmers that are affected by this, and just how heartbreaking and how distressing it is. In terms of our approach, we have a clear plan, and it's to stick to that plan, and that plan is working. The numbers have come down significantly from a peak of 34,500 in England down to below 20,000. And it is for that plan to be rigorously led by the science. And so it is very much informed by the chief vet. It is very much around targeting the high-risk areas. Culling does remain as one of the options within that, because we can see from the numbers coming down and the contrast with Wales, where that hasn't happened, the effectiveness of the plan. But that is different than saying, for example, in all instances one would pivot to culling, because, for example, if cattle's been imported into an area, then that may be the cause of TB. So it's about having a science-led approach, sticking to the plan where one can see the trajectory and keeping options on the table that are working, but doing so in a science-led way.
So keeping everything in the toolbox, from wildlife reservoir control, the Defra test in terms of differentiating between vaccinated and naturally infected animals, and then the vaccination programme itself. All these things you as a government department are carrying on with and following the science.
Yes, and so on the vaccination, we're now into phase 3 of that. So work is ongoing, but it's not ready as yet. So it's about pursuing all the tools that are available, but doing so in a way that is led by the science, and one that fits within what primary legislation allows.
And that comes back to the points made about the APHA, that they were pivotal in much of this in terms of the Defra test as well. So a lot of that work is, this critical infrastructure helps with that. Thank you very much for that. Chopping around some of the different diseases now, we've had a lot of importation of animals into this country. In the pandemic, people taking on pets, and a real surge in traffic in dogs coming into this country from the continent of Europe. And we're going to be talking about some of the legislation to try and control that. We've taken evidence, and the British Veterinary Association and various stakeholders have called for a sensible approach to protect our borders. Now that we've left the European Union, we can be very tight on biosecurity. So some of these dogs coming in have diseases that are not endemic in this country, such as Brucella canis, which is a horrible disease for the dog and potentially zoonotic, and there have been a couple of cases in people. So the veterinary profession, this committee, have been calling for the government to do strategic pre-import testing for some of these non-endemic diseases, such as Brucella canis. Is that something that the government is listening to and will take action on to actually keep animals and people safe in our country?
Well, I think in terms of listening to the British Veterinary Association, very much so. As you know, Dr. Hudson, I spoke at their recent event and joined a second event that they held here in the House of Commons, all within the last 6 weeks or so. So I think in terms of engaging and looking at the evidence there, I think on biosecurity more widely, the controls we're putting in place make the distinction between where people are acting illegally, where very much through Defra and the checks we have in place there, versus whether it is legal imports and what controls we put around medium and high risk. That's more on the food security side. If there's specific evidence in terms of pets, then obviously we're happy to look at that and to hear what the BVA have to say.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Just going back to bovine TB, I wonder if it'd be possible maybe to collate the data in a way that is understandable for people, because there's a lot of false facts being put around, a lot of selective quoting of data. I mean, would it be an idea maybe to just to explain to people how important it is, not only for health of cattle, but health of badgers as well? Is that something you might consider doing?
So Robert, very happy. If the committee has suggestions as to how you want that data presented, then I think the PermSec and I would be very happy to look at that and see how we can work with you, because it is such an emotive topic. It is important that we get the data in the format that is most usable for the people that need it.
Yeah, I'm sure the Chief Vet and Gideon Henderson maybe will try and do that. I think it would help with the general public who generally take one side or another and ignore the facts, and maybe getting a little bit more data out there. Thank you. Barry.
Thank you, Chair. I want to talk about import checks and the border target operating model that you're introducing. But before that, just a couple of quick ones. I would say that actually I'm pleased with the engagement that you've had as the new Secretary of State with the committee, and thank you for that. It's been in contrast, I think, with some of your predecessors, so it's welcome.
This is lulling into a false sense of security before we start.
I tried to start off gently, Chair. The first question really is, in light of what the Office of Environmental Protection said in its annual progress report in January, they talked about I think what is a shared objective for the government to have its commitment that everyone should live within 15 minutes walk of green or blue space. And they said that you need to provide an assessment demonstrating that its current funding, that the department's current funding and actions will fulfill that commitment. So it's really a plea for when we'll get detailed plans. The commitment is not for, this year, it's for within 5 years, I think. But what the OEP was saying is we need to see that you are putting the resources and the actions in place to make sure that we get there.
Yeah. Well, firstly, I can reassure you, Mr. Garner, of the commitment, not least when I was Secretary for State for Health. One of the things I was massively pushing was the benefits of green social prescribing. And I think many people anecdotally from the COVID pandemic talked about the benefit of being outside, going for a walk, having time in green spaces. So this is something, I think my track record in government, I pushed it as Chief Secretary. In fact, I chaired a round table looking at access to green spaces when I was Chief Secretary, and then pushed it when I was Chancellor of Duchy of Lancaster, and then continued when I was Health Secretary. So this is something I'm personally very, very committed to.
Scale for
we're pushing. I mean, one of the challenges with the Office for the Environment was their initial report was 4 months into a 25-year programme, but your substance on are we moving as quickly as we can on our plans to accelerate access to green spaces for all? Absolutely. So the sort of meetings I have been having is on things like Generation Green, which is looking at, through our youth hostel network, how we get more disadvantaged kids to go and experience national parks. And if we can get up to 100,000 a year is what we're aiming for. Looking at...
I'm going to cut you short,
okay,
Secretary of State. Not because I'm not interested,
yeah.
I am, and if you want to give a fuller explanation in writing, but it really is just to make a plea, please, let's get the demonstration of the detail out there as quickly as possible.
One of the most important things we need is a measure so that we can... There are a range of things that we are doing, as the Secretary of State was saying. One of the really important things is how do we measure whether we are achieving that ambition, and we are working on that, and we should have an update on how we're going to measure that in the summer, which I think is which I think will be the starting point for what you're looking for.
That's good.
We'll push it, and things like the King Charles III pathways, the coastal paths. There's a whole load of initiatives in this area.
Okay. Now the second is a more sensitive one, and you quite rightly, Secretary of State, recused yourself from the decision about the incinerator in your own constituency, and I don't propose to question you further on that. So the question really is to Ms. Finkelstein, and that is, if you can let us know on what date the Secretary of State recused himself, any discussions or communications that had taken place between the department or between the Secretary of State and the EA or any other ministers in response in relation to it, and just really the due diligence. If you can just make sure that that's done in public, then it absolutely sets everything transparently.
Well, so firstly, all ministers need to balance their constituency role and their ministerial role. And I want to take this opportunity to apologise to the committee for not formally recusing myself sooner and updating the Register of Interests regarding what was well known in public, but should have been updated on the actual record regarding my opposition to the incinerator. To reassure the committee, I've been clear throughout that I need to step back from any decision as Secretary of State, which is why I flagged my constituency interest. And I said the policy needed to be delegated to another minister, recognising the importance of the ministerial code in terms of conflicts of interest and also the perception of any conflicts of interest. I wasn't, Sir Robert, made aware until later that I required a formal recusal. I thought by delegating it, I had acted to, in essence, take myself and step back from it. But as soon as I was notified by the Permanent Secretary of the need to formally recuse, that is exactly what I did.
I mean, standards and privilege is not necessarily within the remit of this committee, but I appreciate
absolutely,
that clarification.
and all I'm asking for is that the Prime Sec gives us the details and the dates and so on, so that's fine. Look,
I mean, that's not the conversations that we have and the advice that I give is private, so it's not not something on which I would be setting out details.
I sorry, please be clear. I haven't asked for your private conversations with the Secretary of State. What I'm asking for is a record of any conversations between the Secretary of State and either the Environment Agency on this matter, or between him and any other ministers. That's all. Okay.
Well, again, just perhaps to reassure the committee, I'll respond because I know that my Shadow Secretary of State has raised some questions, but just to reassure the committee, I've never made representations as Secretary of State to the EA in terms of the incinerator in Wisbech. But I will respond to my Shadow Secretary on those points.
Thank you very much. Look, now turning to the border target model. Last week, it was reported that Portsmouth's purpose-built £24 million control post may be closed down. And the British Ports Association has also said that Defra is yet to inform ports what staffing, opening hours and pricing regime will be required when the next stage of the border target operating model is implemented on the 30th of April. Given the closeness of that date, what confidence do you have that ports are actually going to be ready?
Well, we had a lot of similar stories before the January deadline when we were bringing in the health certificates, and through the work both of colleagues in the department but also Lord Robbie Douglas-Miller that leads on this. Then I think a lot of the scare stories that were pertaining to January didn't emerge. Now, a huge amount of work. In fact, one of the things we were criticised for as a government was the fact that various things were delayed on this, and obviously time was taken through those delays to get things ready. So that is something that I know a huge amount of work has been going on. I know Lord Douglas-Miller has been very actively involved in that. And the intention in April is to take a light touch approach as we bed it in. So all of those things are all part of the planning that's been put in place.
I mean, just say we've been working very closely with all the ports, and we have quite a lot of confidence that they will have the capacity in place in order to manage the checks that we bring in April.
Well, you will know that the Dover District Council have sent a letter to the chair of the committee in response to the letter that Lord Douglas-Miller sent. I have to say it's one of the most excoriating letters I've ever seen in relation to what a minister has said and put in writing. It says not only that some of the things that he has put to this committee are misleading, it has said that they are incorrect. And in relation to the introduction of the new requirements, which he says are there to strengthen the biosecurity regime, it points out, for example, that the rest of the world imports are already subject to risk-based controls and can't leave a point of entry until full checks are completed. Yet Defra plans to change this practice for the short straits, allowing the rest of the world food that is classified as higher risk to arrive and leave the port without control. This will not meet the high standards required to protect the nation's biosecurity. That's, of course, referring to the move 22 miles inland to Sevington. So you say that you're in good communication with the ports and the port authorities. Their view of the matter is hugely different from that set out by Lord Douglas Miller in his letter to this committee.
So, firstly, Mr. Garner, I've not had an opportunity. I think that letter's just come in.
Yeah, probably we only agreed to publish
It
the
has
letter.
been published, has it?
Immediately.
Okay. But I
it will
did.
be on our website if
Okay, so I haven't seen that, but I did speak to Lord Douglas Miller last night about Dover, just to get an update in terms of where we are. I think, firstly, just in terms of investment, because it links to your previous question, £200 million of funding through the Port Infrastructure Fund has been allocated to 41 ports. So significant investment has been made. Now, it is the case that because the dealing with the legal imports of food has moved from Dover, that has led to a reduction in the funding to Dover, who continue to be responsible for the illegal controls, the illegal port risk checks at Dover. So Dover continues to be the front line for that, but where through the health certificates advanced information is providing on a risk-based basis, that is taken away from Dover. Now, Dover Port Authority is not content with that decision, but there are very good reasons for that, not least because Dover doesn't have sufficient space, in our view, to carry out the checks that are needed in terms of those health certificates. We visited the port ourselves, and that was very clear. There was no space. They made it clear to us. Yeah. Thank you, Sir Robert. So to me, through my discussion with Lord Douglas Robert Miller, that was the crux of the issue, that Dover didn't have the space. I very much welcome that is also the committee's view. That is why a decision was taken to move some of the work, and with moving some of the work, some of the money has moved as well. So I think that's been one of the key issues.
Well, you say some of the money has moved as well. Can we just clarify? On the 23rd of November last year, Defra verbally committed that they would cut funding to 1 million. Then that went to 1.2 on the 15th of December. And then we understand that after the first year, so there'll be a 66% cut in the first year, and then the funding will actually reduce to zero for DPHA.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
I mean, it will, in terms of for, as the Secretary of State says, the checks on the legal imports. They will have some funding to do. They do checks actually at the port, and they support border force on some of the checks we do for African swine fever and so on. That will continue. It was. Initially we were looking at how much capacity we needed, not at the port, but actually Bastion Point, which is under Dover, and Sevington. Turns out we do not need both of those, and on with a very careful analysis, we are concentrating those checks at Sevington. We are at the moment, they will get some funding because we are holding the sort of option there until we have that the action that the checks at Sevington settle down. Then that will go to naught because we are not going to be using
the checks at Sevington settle down
because we will not be using Bastion Point, which is.
The Port Authority has told us that you've underestimated the number of inspections that will be required at Sevington by 1.1 million a year. It would perhaps be important to share with the committee why you believe that your modelling is better than their own, particularly given that they've evidenced what they've said when they've looked, and again this is in response to Lord Douglas Miller's letter. They say that since the 31st of January, Defra have reported that for the whole of GB, that's covering all ports, just 50,000 SPS notifications have been received, to which they've provided feedback to only 250 importers. They say that the Dover Port Health Authority's imported food data shows that during exactly the same period, 20 days, greater than 95,500 SPS controls travelled through Dover alone. Now, that is an order of magnitude of difference in the estimates, but these are not estimates. This is what you've recorded and what they've recorded. That implies that somebody's modelling somewhere is deeply awry.
We're happy to give you, more information on our modelling. Our modelling is not just based on the SPS forms that we've been receiving, because obviously that is building up as people get used to that system. We have made estimates and we are confident that we have the capacity at Sevington. As I say, we are providing some funding to Bastion Point that, if there was significant adjustment required, we could reconsider. But we are confident that Sevington will have the capacity. And, it will not start by taking, for example, live animals, and we will look at that as we go further down. We're doing sensible programme management as we kind of roll things out and take stock, but we're confident of our broadening of our model.
Let me just pick up on the issue at the second phase, which will be introduced in April. The transitional grant funding scheme will end as intended, and then the department has said that at that point the port health authorities will be able to charge traders to recover costs. In fact, the DPHA will not be able to charge traders to recover costs, they say, that are associated with ASF work. The BTOM covers commercial food checks that can be charged for, but the impact of Defra's intended actions to remove the DPHA's ability to complete commercial import checks that are fee-generating at Dover, leaving only personal import checks that are not fee-generating, prevents the authority from being able to financially support itself. So, the assertion that PHAs will be able to recover their costs appears to be misguided at best, does it not?
I mean, the Dover PHA will not be being funded. Will not be getting funding for the legal imports, because that's not what they're going to be checking. But they will get funding to continue their work with Border Force on some of those illegal imports. So I think there's something slightly misleading on what you have provided to you. But Dover was unhappy about the decision that Sevington will be the main way in which the legal imports will be checked, but they will get funding for their work on illegal imports.
Well, as I say, there's a huge discrepancy in the number of checks that you believe will be required at Sevington and that they believe will be required at Sevington, and they state that your original data were incorrectly reported and modelled from the start, and that leads them to the view that there'll be a 1.1 million excess to what you've modelled. But you also seem perhaps to have accounted for that yourselves, because in the Financial Times in February, they raised concerns relating to the automated clearing process, the timed out decision contingency feature in this, which would allow the movement of animal products into the UK from the EU without any documentary checks or physical inspection in exceptional circumstances. So if there were to be this surplus, this 1.1 million a year extra, which can't be coped for through Sevington, it would imply that actually you're simply going to allow the risks of contamination through animal products, through meat, to come in without any checks whatsoever. How do you justify that? Because it seems to me that you've built into the structure of this programme the get-out clause that, well, if all else fails, we'll just open the floodgates. How can that be a responsible approach to sanitary and phytosanitary control?
So the controls will be in place.
Well, they're not. No, they won't. And that's precisely the point.
The controls and checks will be in place. It is sensible to consider what action would you take if there was a very big, build up of traffic, a reason it
precisely as DPHA have suggested there will be, because your modelling was wrong in the first place.
Well, I think the point is it's the advantage of Sevington is it has modern purpose-built facilities, point one. Point two, as Sir Robert has already touched on when the committee visited, Dover doesn't have the space. Point three, we're taking a risk-based approach, which is focused on medium and high risk, and that also interplays with non-EU goods as well. So by all means, Mr. Garner, we can take away the modelling and look at the concerns that quite reasonably you've raised and come back to hopefully give you some reassurance as to why the modelling that the department has, we feel, is sufficient. But the key is to take a risk-based approach, and that is what underscores everything that we're doing at the border.
But Secretary of State, would you agree that to have built into this process an endpoint that says, should all else fail, we will simply open the floodgates and allow animal products, meat, into this country without any checks whatsoever, is the wrong strategy?
That is not my understanding. My understanding is taking a risk.
It is exactly the timed out, it's called the timed out decision contingency feature, which your department has put in as the end stop of this process should Sevington be overwhelmed, as indeed this committee has been informed it may be.
I don't think there's a basis on which we would expect Sevington to be overwhelmed. Okay.
In that case, I understand that the letter from Dover is there on the website. You've been notified of it, and we've asked that you should give a point-by-point response to all the issues raised in what is a really comprehensive response to Lord Douglas Miller's letter to this committee, as I say, in quite an excoriating way. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. Just one point about Sevington. It's obviously 22 miles from Dover. What procedures will be in place to ensure that when consignments are diverted to Sevington, they'll actually arrive there, they won't be transshipped or dumped in a lay-by or something else?
Indeed.
Well, again, because it's risk-based, we'll know what is coming, and that's part of the work that has been done. So illegal things will be checked at Dover. It is where through the risk assessment, we've made an assessment. Those are the ones that would be going to Sevington.
Secretary of State, have you ever heard of the phrase, a lock will deter an honest citizen?
I have, but I've also heard of the fact that lots of ports are large. If you look around the world, often you will find ports actually that are that sort of distance anyway within the port. So I get the point about the journey from Dover to Sevington. You could quite often do that within a port if you look around the world at the size of some ports.
Thank you. Oh.
Thank you very much. Secretary of State, I'd like to turn to food policy, and then, if you don't mind, come on with just a couple of questions about fisheries. In February, the Prime Minister announced that the government will publish an annual food security index, as has been mentioned, a measure that the committee called for last year, and we're very grateful. What indicators will be measured as part of this index, and how do you expect it to influence your policy decisions?
Well, that is something we're discussing at the moment following the NFU announcement with key stakeholders in terms of what constitutes the Food Security Index. Part of the commitment from the Prime Minister was to make that an annual update. There's already the 3-year review, the more substantive 3-year review that is in place. And the idea is to be able to set out the details of that index when we have the Farm to Fork Summit.
Thank you. And in his speech to the NFU conference, the Prime Minister committed to placing the publication of the index on a statutory footing when parliamentary time allows. Have you got any indication as to when this might be?
As you all well know, parliamentary time is determined by business managers, as Sir Robert knows, having worked in the Whip's office. So I'm not in a position to announce on that. Time obviously is very constrained between now and the general election, but it underscores the Prime Minister's wider commitment to the Food Security Index. And it is something that NFU colleagues in particular had been asking for some time.
Thank you. And as part of our Fairness in the Food Supply Chain inquiry, we've heard that supermarkets and processors are quick to raise prices due to external pressures. For example, inflation could be one of them, but slow to reduce them when those pressures ease. Do you recognise this phenomenon, and how are you ensuring equitable relationships in the food supply chain?
Well, I think it's something we all hear as constituency MPs. I represent, as you know, a farming constituency, and often there is concern around the supply chain and imbalances in power, asymmetries in power within that. That is why through the work that the Minister for Farming and Fishing has been doing, Mark Spencer's work on supply chain reviews, we've already tabled the legislation on dairy. I think, Sir Robert, that's been well received. We're now working at pace on the pig sector, on the supply chain there. We have work ongoing in other areas, horticulture and so forth. So we are working through, and it is also a point when I met with the supermarket chief execs that I raised with them directly, that it is important that action is taken to address some of the concerns, all of the concerns that are raised, but some concerns are particularly pertinent.
Thank you. And if I could just finally on food, turn to a practice that we've heard called shrinkflation, where product sizes are reduced and prices kept the same. Should supermarkets be obliged to actively inform consumers when a product size has been reduced like that?
I think there's a wider point that I will point to, which is how we better empower the consumer. And one of the reasons we've got the review that I announced at the Oxford Farming conference was the sense on a slightly different issue, but the sense of consumers not being aware when, for example, something is sold as British bacon, when the pig had been reared overseas, and or where a shelf had a Union Jack on, but the products on it were not British. So I think there's a wider point around labelling. I think there's always a balance between how much regulation and cost of business from change one introduces and how you get the balance between that, because of the cost of living, time when cost of living is under pressure. One wants to ensure that food prices are kept as low as possible, but at the same time, given the high quality of produce that is produced in the UK, we want to ensure that consumers are empowered and not misled, that when they are buying British, it is actually British that they're getting. So that's a slightly different point to the size of the packs, but I think it's within the same policy area, which is how much regulation do you have in order to ensure that the consumer is making an informed choice.
Thank you very much. And if I can now turn to fisheries, I mean, it wouldn't be an inquiry with the Secretary of State in front of us if I didn't ask questions on fisheries. So there's just a few. I mean, obviously, we've got the ongoing issue of the pollock closure. Just on a general point, can you confirm that scientists, when they brief industries, and I've been to some of these briefings myself when I chaired a fish producer organisation, they don't actually make announcements about quota. They indicate what the state of the stocks could be, but at their mid-year presentation, they don't actually make announcements about what the quota is going to be for the next year. So that's normally taken by ministers, quite rightly, at the end of the year. Could you just confirm that that is the case?
Well, I recognise, Ms. Moore, this is a sector you know incredibly well, and I think your understanding is the same as mine, that quite often in June an indication is signalled, but there is still sometimes debate as to what that then means, what is the size of any reduction that then follows, and that a final determination is made in December ahead of January. Now, I think you mentioned Pollock. I think there are some interesting and important questions that flow from that, particularly where the change is substantial as to what the right level of notice is for the sector, and that's something that I'm actively looking at. On Pollock more generally, we have already announced support for diversification and some other mitigations, but I recognise there is an ongoing challenge there, and one of the concerns that has been raised with me is whether the level of notice was sufficient at an early enough stage.
And just following on from that, there was a formal consultation in December in 2023 following an emergency bylaw that was proposed by Cornwall IFCA. And very clearly they wrote to fishermen with shellfish viviers on the 9th of December 2022 and said they wouldn't be allowed to go to sea from the 2nd of January. After reflection of the committee, they realised that they did have to carry out a formal consultation. They stopped that bylaw and they carried out a formal consultation which kept everybody happy. So that's an example, would you not agree, that that's a responsible way of dealing with any stock or effort discrepancies?
Well, I suspect it reflected local knowledge without being as familiar with that set of circumstances. But if the local committee was suggesting a very dramatic change and then that was modified, then I'd be keen to understand that decision more, but it suggests that reflected local discussion and about getting the right balance. And I think the wider point I would say is, and I think the same applies within the farming sector as well, which is, just as farmers, to me, care deeply about the countryside and the environment, not least because they want to pass it on to future generations in good health, which is why it shouldn't be two competing camps between the environment and food production. I think we need to bring those more closely aligned. I find the same when talking to the fishing community, that fishers care deeply about the sustainability of stocks. They want to work with the science, but the challenge quite often voiced with me is whether they're getting sufficient notice or whether the tiller is yanked too quickly. And obviously from a business planning point of view, that can create challenges of itself, and it's important we get the right balance when we're looking at the timing of these decisions.
Thank you. And Chairman, just one more, and thank you for allowing me to come in and ask these questions. Are you aware of the abundance of bass during the close season that is in place and everybody agreed with? I've had vessels tell me that they've tried to move areas where they've shot their nets and they're still catching bass, and of course they can't because it's a closed season. So this will really highlights the fact that sometimes fishery science isn't precise. And of course, bass and pollock have swim bladders, so they die when they're bored. And I just wondered whether, there is any plans to perhaps introduce a measure where emergency measures could be introduced at short notice when this sort of thing happens?
Well, I absolutely accept, Mr. Murray, that the science isn't precise. And I think that is partly why through the various marine plans the department's working on, there is alongside looking at the pressure on space with offshore wind and some of the other competing factors, that we are investing significantly in how we improve the science. Indeed, the response to pollock and the change there includes some funding to support on improving our data moving forward. I think also more widely, it's important that we get the balance on the various committees right so that the fishing voice is fairly reflected. And again, a concern raised with me by the industry is whilst that is the case on some committees, it's not always the case. And so how we make sure that those, again, who have perhaps the strongest interest in sustainable stocks, because it is core to their long-term business interest, how we ensure that they're fairly reflected on committees, I think is something we just need to look at the balance of and perhaps tweak to get it right.
Just one very last supplementary. Obviously, you can have natural occurring disasters, which we saw with the shellfishermen in the Tees area last year. But you can also have imposed impacts on fisheries, like the pollock situation, where decisions were taken at very short notice that could potentially cause a very viable fishing vessel to go into bankruptcy without some assistance. I know you've said about the help that you've given to some fishermen for diversification. You've also introduced some various methods of capture with assistance to participate in a scientific study. But that leaves an awful lot of fishermen that could potentially face bankruptcy if they aren't helped. So will you please look at perhaps speaking to the Treasury to find a way to perhaps financially compensate these vessels when they rely on them for their income in January and February? There aren't that many of them, but they really do need some help. So would you look at that, please?
I'm very happy to take that away. I think you set out a powerful case around the interaction between the late notice and the question around compensation. Obviously, there's always issues to be weighed there around precedent risk, value for money, and those sort of considerations that you expect any department also needs to weigh. But I think alongside that, how we ensure moving forward we get the right level of notice, and particularly depending on what level of impact there is. So where there's a very significant impact on the business, then obviously that can be particularly harmful to those sectors. So I will take this issue away and come back to you on it.
Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you, Chairman, for allowing me to come in and ask those questions.
Thank you, Shel. We told there may be a possibility of votes on this particular measure, so we try and make a bit more progress if we can. But Kat, you wanted to come in on an allergy issue?
Yes, two slight issues, one being allergies and the other being just to thank you for your answer to my colleague about shrinkflation, but just to stress that for those that have diabetes, when the grams of carbs in products goes down, it can lead to it being more difficult to manage blood sugar. So just to give you that piece of information to help you pursue that. But on food allergies, I did meet with Paul Carey yesterday, who's the dad of Owen Carey, who Owen's Law has been named after, who's my colleague's constituent. And he asked me to ask you today about progress that your department is making in terms of implementing Owen's Law to make sure that no more tragedies happen when people who have food allergies, who make up about 1 to 2% of the UK population, are eating out in restaurants, and how quickly can we see change here?
We're leading on health. What's that? No. So if Ms. Smith, I can come back to you on. I mean, the importance of the issue, I think, is clear when, as constituents MPs, we meet those that have been directly affected. So, firstly, just to put on record just how important an issue it is, and in terms of the exact progress, because quite often these issues are more for the Department of Health through the food standards regulations. So, and that usually falls within Lord Markham's portfolio. So, if it helps the committee, I will sort of pick up with him and come back to you with a fuller answer. Yeah. Given the sensitivity, I don't want to give an answer without fully checking in as to what the latest progress is on Owen's Law.
I'd be happy to have an answer in writing. Thank you.
Okay.
If I could just come back in...
Very briefly.
Yeah, very briefly. Secretary of State, I've been dealing with this particular matter, I know the Food Standards Agency have made a recommendation, and I have written to your colleague about it. And I wouldn't name my constituent normally, and I would like to apologise to him for actually naming him in a public forum like that, because I don't really think it's correct. Thank you.
Really noted.
Okay, thank you. Rosie.
Thanks, Chair. Moving on to labour shortages, which is one of the many issues that my farmers have many sleepless nights about in the last few years. John Shropshire's review into labour shortages in the food supply chain was published in June, and your response has been delayed several times. Given the acute shortages in many agri-food sectors, why hasn't the department published a response, and when can we expect to see it?
Well, it's a very fair point, and just to reassure the committee, I have met with John Shropshire and discussed his report with him. I think it's an extremely important report. Obviously, what Mr. Shropshire was focused on was the long-term position, so it isn't the issue in terms of this year. And when I say this year, 2024, so going into the year ahead, it's around the longer-term position. I think to give reassurance, if one looks at the number of visas used, I think 34,000 was the last number I had out of an overall quantum of 45,000 with an option for a further 10,000 on top of that, and that in turn excludes the 2,000 for poultry. So actually there's been an oversupply in terms of the available visas to what has been the need, and hopefully that gives reassurance that one of the things we're absolutely clear on is we don't have a situation where there isn't sufficient labour in order to harvest crops. I've come back to my key strategic objective being food production, food security, and labour is a part of that. The reason for the delay, and I'll be very upfront with the committee on it, is I think there is an opportunity within certain sectors, not all, but certain sectors within the farming sector, to do more on automation. So pack houses and automating within pack houses, for example. Now, what is needed there is we need to get the balance right in terms of the grants and the financial support we give to facilitate that. But I think there are areas where we can automate more and bring down our labour requirement and increase our productivity and therefore our profitability. And that's what we're trying to do through the various grants. That's why it's taken a little longer. But the overall commitment, we have significantly more visas than is needed. SARS, of course, are not part of the immigration figures. They're out with those figures. But it's important that we automate more and bring the numbers down, and that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, the only problem for my fruit farmers is you can't really train machines to pick raspberries and things like that. And they've always said that they really need those seasonal agricultural workers. And it's been an issue for a good couple of years now. They just haven't got the numbers through. But yeah, I mean, thank you. You're obviously really on top of this, actually. And we're, like my colleague Barry said, we're not used to quite having such full answers, actually. But I'll just sort of stick with the questions that the clerks have prepared for us. But we recently heard that the skilled worker visa immigration reforms that will come into force in April will severely hamper our ability to attract and retain skilled agricultural workers and veterinary staff, particularly meat hygiene inspectors. Do you agree with this assessment, and what representations are you making to the Home Office to address those shortages in the key sectors? Yeah,
well, I think there's two, if I may, disaggregate between the SARS, where I think we have sufficient, but quite understandably for businesses wanting to make long-term capital decisions, they want some reassurance about the long-term picture. And whilst I think there's broad reassurance we can give, the absolute numbers is an ongoing discussion with the Home Office, but I hopefully have addressed that. I think on meat and vets, I think that is a more challenging situation, because I think in an ideal world one would look at the legislation around veterinary surgeons, and in particular an issue that the BVA and Dr. Hudson has raised with me is around veterinary nurses more generally, and so some changes there. When it comes to abattoirs, we've got the small abattoir fund, £5 million allocated there. We're flexing the criteria on that to make it more permissive, to try and encourage more applications. And we've always been willing to take a targeted approach. So when I was in a previous role, and there was, you may recall, there's a lot of scare stories saying we're going to run out of turkeys for Christmas. And we did a huge amount of work, and we had plenty of turkeys for Christmas, at which point no one had any interest in it at all, because the scare had been dealt with. So there's loads of stories about the scare, but actually when we got to Christmas and we had plenty of turkeys, there's hardly any coverage whatsoever. But part of that was we were willing to be flexible around what was needed in the slaughterhouses. So we'll look at these things on a case-by-case basis. I think there is scope to automate certain areas. I agree with you on raspberries. I think is very challenging. But I think if you look at the fact that controlled environment growing can be up to 250 times more productive. So you look at sites like Norwich with Fishers, where 4 acres is the equivalent to 1,000 acres of conventional growing. One of the good things about the glass house or the vertical farming is often the labour conditions are more attractive. Things can be at chest height, it's a warmer environment. You can have automation, not to replace individuals, but to actually make them more productive. So I think there's opportunities there, and those are the things we're looking at more widely in the context of the land management strategy.
Thank you. I think Dr. Huston wants to jump in about vets before I go on to...
We touched on vets. Did you want to...
Do you want me to come in now on that? Yeah, okay.
Makes sense,
I just wanted to go a bit further on that. I just want to also declare my personal and professional interest in this as a veterinary surgeon. We had a special session on Defra a couple of weeks ago on shortage of vets in this country, and we've raised concerns about this. And the chief vet told us that we don't currently have a sort of standby surge vet capacity in the event of a significant disease outbreak. And so what happened in 2001, and I was involved in that, vets were called from all aspects to go into the front line. What is the government's view on that? Are they, in terms, if we did, heaven forbid, have something like foot and mouth come in or African swine fever, where are we at in terms of the government keeping a watching brief on how many vets we have and what we're going to do in terms of recruitment and retention if we need more?
Well, it is a very fair challenge, not least because AI sort of showed sort of the pressures on the system. I think firstly, Dr. Hudson, to reassure the committee, this is something that work is already ongoing on. So in 2020, APHA introduced a specialist pay allowance with non-consolidated allowances at 3 levels. So there has been work there. We're working on a cross-government veterinary framework for pay and to consolidate capability pay. So there has been work ongoing on this. I think the legislative changes that the BVA have asked for are difficult this side of an election. But I recognise that I think it's in the 50s when that framework was put in place.
1966. So it's difficult in the current time frame. In the next Parliament, is that something that a government could commit to redoing the Veterinary Surgeons Act, which would cover a lot of these issues? Is that something that you are minded?
No Secretary of State is going to come to a select committee and preempt the manifesto, which will need to go through the usual sort of right round process. And there, I think, firstly, just recognising that the legislation dates back to the mid-60s. So it's not surprising that there is some strain around that. Second, to reassure there has been work ongoing in this space. And thirdly, one of the questions that I discussed with the chief vet was bringing, from my experience in health, when we did the long-term workforce plan for the NHS, one of the things we were looking at there was more flexibility, for example, when people retire, to have roles where they can come back in a more flexible way, not working full-time, but come back perhaps to do some mentoring of the next generation, perhaps to work a more limited number of hours. And I think there's some lessons from what's been done on health around skills mix, having a ladder of opportunity, looking at retirees, looking at the retention policy, and we can apply some of those into the veterinary science field.
Thank you very much. And just finally, I mean, you've said you'd look at this on a sort of case-by-case basis. With the changes to the minimum salary threshold coming up in April, it's going to go to 38,700. We know that recruitment and retention is going to be not an instant fix, so looking at things urgently would be helpful. What's happening as well in the veterinary sector, under the skilled worker visa system, the occupation-specific thresholds are actually raised to the median salary threshold. So actually for a vet working full-time, that would be £48,100. Now, in terms of veterinary sector and meat hygiene and abattoirs, recruiting in vets, say, from the European Union, that is okay if you've got experienced vets who are going to be attracting that sort of salary. There are dispensations if the vets are younger, if they're under 26 years of age, but certainly the veterinary profession has said that salary threshold of 48,100 is going to be problematic, and actually they may struggle to fill the vacancies in key sectors such as in public health and meat hygiene, but also in companion and farm animal practice. So is that something, that discrepancy, that salary threshold, something that you could take away and look at on a case-by-case basis, and if there is an issue that the government, Defra, working with the Home Office, could address that?
I'm very happy to take it away and look at it. Obviously, there's a Home Office equity around that, but I hope, Dr. Hudson, you can see from the conversations we've had on the XL Bully Dog extension that where I think collectively we can make a strong case, then we're very willing to do so with government comments.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. We are very fortunate this afternoon to have a guest cameo appearance from the chair of the Environmental Audit Select Committee, Philip Dunn, who comes hot foot from the Liaison Committee, where he's been asking the Prime Minister about the very point we started on, some of the changes to the support scheme. So, but Philip, you're going to talk about plastic waste.
Thank you very much, Sir Robert. Yes, I should just declare my interest as a farmer in front of this committee. Thank you for inviting me to join you, and thank you. Apologies, Secretary of State, for arriving late, but Sir Robert has explained why. I'd like to ask some quick-fire questions on the deposit return scheme, because I'm conscious that we may be heading to a vote, and I'd like to get them all in first. So it was about a year ago when the government announced how it intended to introduce a deposit return scheme in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. And since when there's been issues in Scotland, which I'll come back to, but could you please indicate when we can expect implementing legislation to be laid?
So I'm not in a position to give an exact date today, because I think as a unionist, one of the things that has been very important to me is that we have an approach that is interoperable across the UK. And it is right, therefore, that we work closely with the DAs to have a scheme that aligns. And I think also that's important to business as well, because I think it would be hugely frustrating to business if we had different schemes in different parts of the United Kingdom. But I think the wider point, and Mr. and you have championed this, the importance in terms of the fact that 55% of litter falls within the DRS. This is high quality product that can be recycled. The importance of policy is there, and that's why we've been working so closely with the DAs on it.
So the Scottish scheme wanted to include glass, and as a result of the representations under the UK Internal Market Act, that has not proceeded at the moment. The Welsh Government is proposing to include glass within their scheme. Would it be fair to assume that the UK Government will use the same mechanism to encourage the Welsh to become more interoperable?
Yes.
Thank you. You've covered three of my questions in that answer. That's excellent. When can we expect schemes to be implemented? If you can't tell us when you're going to lay the legislation, have you got... the industry has been expecting this to have been introduced next year originally. Yeah. What can you indicate to industry as a reasonable time frame?
Yeah, I think, again, it's a very fair point, and this is why we've been working with industry closely on it. We have a deposit return scheme industry forum. We have a sector-specific series of subgroups that are working on that. I think, given this balance between the benefits of the scheme versus the benefits of having something interoperable, I don't think 2025 is now realistic, and certainly I don't think business would view it as a realistic deadline. So it is an issue that is still ongoing, an ongoing area of discussion within government. But I suspect if I was pushed on it, a sort of 2027 deadline is probably more likely, but it is an area that is being discussed within government. So I'm not in a position to give a date on it, but certainly 2025 I don't think is realistic.
Thank you. And a final question from me, if I may. Just you did touch on land use framework in an earlier answer. That's something that our committee, the Environmental Audit Committee, on which 2 members of this committee sit, so they're very aware of it, have been pressing for some clarity as to when we can expect a land use framework. Can you share any thoughts on that with this committee?
I think it is both that and the Labour review, I think, are 2 hugely important documents, and there is always a trade-off between pace and getting them right. I think, but I'm very aware of the importance of getting the land management document out. So I'm not in a position to give a date on that, but it is something we're engaging very, very heavily on. So it's not through omission, it's because we want to actually get that right. And as you will be well aware, there is a range of competing equities. So between food production and food security, which is my personal view, has sometimes in the past not been given as much cross-government weight as I believe it should be. And I want to be able to have those discussions, not least with colleagues in the Department for Energy, who understandably will look at issues like pylons going across rural areas, amongst other things. Obviously getting the balance right on the environment, where I've given a direction of travel in terms of, I think, the scope to do that. I mentioned as part of the land management strategy the opportunities around controlled environment growing and the huge productivity gain, but also how that is beneficial in terms of labour. You can cite those near to major cities, making the labour recruitment easier, can make the jobs better. You can tie that in with energy policy in terms of grid connection. I think it opens up some other questions, Mr. Dunn, around things like solar on farmland. Personally, I'm very sceptical as to why we're putting solar on grade 1, grade 2 land, for example. And so I think the land management strategy needs to consider those sort of issues. And so there is a trade-off between the pace of that and the fact that this is something that multiple departments quite rightly have a strong interest in. And I want to get that balance right, but it is something we're very much working on.
Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. I'd like to ask you a little bit about this, which has been described by some people as a bit crazy, the not for EU labelling. I'll give you 2 examples of companies I've spoken to recently. One company more famous for its chocolate bars, but also makes pet food, who make a cat food in France to supply the UK, and they have to apparently label that not for EU. Another company that supplies the Northern Ireland via the Republic of Ireland with chocolate, famous for being served at various ambassadors' events, if you can get my drift. And so we have goods produced in the EU to EU standards that are going to have to be stamped not to EU. And I think there's even some talk that there could be legal action taken by some of these manufacturers. Do you agree that some of these labelling requirements will come with high costs that will have to be passed on to consumers? And how would you respond to criticism levelled at the proposed scheme of not for EU labelling?
Well, firstly, as you know, Sir Robert, part of the Windsor framework on which the House voted included that we would have a consultation on that, and the Safeguarding the Union Command Paper on the 31st of January of this year also confirmed the government's intention to legislate. But at the same time, we've got a consultation, and I think part of the consultation on not for EU is understanding with colleagues within the food manufacturing sector what are the regulatory burdens, what are the costs that would be imposed, and I think there's then an opportunity to look at the policy in that context to understand the original concern within the Windsor framework, which was whether parts of the United Kingdom wouldn't get goods, namely Northern Ireland. So whether how one safeguards against that, that's what the original intention with the Not for EU was addressing. But clearly through the consultations, we want to look at what the cost of business are and what other proposals they might come forward with.
I mean, there seems to be a particular hobby horse of the European Commission. I had a meeting with my opposite number in Rome, and they're as perplexed about the whole thing as we are, and don't see why we should have this labelling requirement. I mean, is it possible we could have a more proportionate approach with more flexibility, or maybe even a carton stamping system where you don't have to put it on the label of every product, just make sure the boxes are stamped with an indication that's coming to the United Kingdom and therefore not being able to be exported to the Republic of Ireland, even though, of course, most of these goods are available in both places.
So I absolutely hear the concern. That's why we've had the consultation. That closed on the 15th of March. We've got a 12-week period to then work through that and respond. So that is something we're actively considering. I met the Secretary of State for Business and Trade this morning, and we discussed this issue. So we will look at it in the context of the responses to the consultation, but also cognizant of the fact that the Windsor Framework made certain commitments, and we need to be clear-sighted on those.
Would you agree maybe some bilateral discussions with capitals around Europe rather than people in Brussels might yield a little bit of progress in the Council of Ministers, possibly?
It's a while since I was Brexit Secretary, so I don't want to stray into old turf. But I think with all policy, it's understanding what the concern was within the provision in the Windsor Framework, and if through the consultations there are constructive suggestions from industry, then of course I'm sure Foreign Office colleagues and others working with us will be keen to explore those as required.
Would you share my concerns that the definition of food which is within scope is entirely defined by reference to EU rules, and therefore would be vulnerable to any unilateral changes in the EU in terms of its own food safety rules, so we could find that things change without us having any ability to really make any representations in that regard?
Well, again, I think these are exactly the issues that come out in the full impact assessment that we're working on. It is very much why we've been consulting closely with business, which as a department we very much have in response to this. As I say, Parliament has voted for the Windsor Framework. That includes certain commitments, but the reason we have the consultation is to tease out exactly these sort of issues and how we ensure that we get the policy right.
Could there be any financial assistance available maybe to companies to deal with some of these additional costs?
I think we indicated that there was going to be.
Yes.
I think we've already given a commitment that there would be financial support in respect to this.
Yeah, there's support for that labelling for goods that are moving into Northern Ireland at present.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm not sure if we're going to have a division in the House, but in case we don't, Rosie has a question on mental health, which she's going to come in with.
Yeah, we did our inquiry on rural mental health, and one of the people that we consulted and gave evidence to us was the Royal Agricultural Benevolent Institution, and they're the largest charity provider of financial and mental health support services to the farming community in the UK. Through their big farming survey, they heard from 15,000 farming people about their rising mental health needs and the financial pressures that they're facing. The survey showed that almost half, about 47% of respondents were experiencing anxiety, and over a third, 36%, are possibly or probably depressed. The tractor protests in London yesterday and in Kent 2 weeks ago demonstrate the uncertainty that farmers face. How do you respond to their concerns, and have you got plans to meet with them about those issues?
Yeah, I think this is probably one of the things I'm most concerned about, which is when one hears the story about particularly suicide within farming communities. And I spoke with the widow of someone who had very tragically taken their own life after a very, very minor issue that was picked up on an inspection, but it had a catastrophic effect. And so I think what is very much shaping my approach is firstly what direct support we can give to the relevant charities, and the Prime Minister announced additional funding at the NFU conference directly to 3 key mental health charities working with the rural community. Secondly, I've had meetings with the RPA to discuss with them how we change the relationship from one where many farmers feel it's based on suspicion and almost they have to prove before they get paid, rather than one of trust. So rather than it being almost people being, feeling as if someone's trying to catch them out, it becomes more advisory, it becomes more supportive. And so a specific change there is to stop the unannounced farm visits, so that people have 48 hours, and to change those from ones where they're seen as to give advice so people can do the right thing, rather than to see if someone can be caught on a technicality and not paid. Because obviously that, at a time of volatility, causes huge amounts of distress. We're looking at what specific things we can do in terms of changes to statutory instruments, so sheep tags, for example, being one example that's recently been covered in the news. So we're looking at, from a regulatory point of view, what we can ease, how the RPA changes its relationship. It's something we discuss more widely with Natural England and the Environment Agency as well. There's the wider package of support in terms of productivity and grants and speeding those. Looking at whether we speed up payments. One of the challenges, and it might be something the committee is interested in exploring, is when I sort of challenge why sometimes farmers have to wait so long for their grants, because that is one of the causes of mental distress, is they've had to pay up front, and the concern about this, the risk that's explained to me is it's often because of the National Audit Office rules around fraud and error and 1%, and therefore a risk-averse nature is taken by the arm's length bodies. I just wonder, as a committee, that might be something that, Sir Robert, just as we get our risk appetite right collectively, because I think if we can speed up payments, that in turn at a time of volatility would help hugely with some of the mental health issues that people have. It's the uncertainty sometimes that causes the distress. So specific funding for mental charities, work on grants, work with the arm's length bodies, statutory instruments that are being changed. So there's a range of things we're looking at, but obviously there's more to do.
Thank you. That was a really comprehensive answer, and I know certainly my farmers, the sort of pressure and the changes in all of the sort of hurdles they've had to jump over since Brexit and all of the new, laws changing over, has just been, there's so much pressure. Things change so fast, and the payments obviously taking ages to get through. So you've mentioned that. Thank you. But this survey also found that young women, I was really surprised, have the lowest mental health and the highest depression levels, particularly women aged 25 to 34. So I just wonder if the department can look at specifically supporting those women and having those conversations with the Benevolent Institute as well, perhaps, and getting involved somehow there.
I'd be very happy to, and if there's some specific data you're able to share with us after the hearing, I'll be extremely keen to follow that up. I mean, immediately when you raise that, having previously been Health Secretary, what it makes me think about is whether we could connect that with the NHS app. So one of the challenges in rural areas is often isolation. I think one of the big changes which has had probably very little coverage, but I think certainly as Health Secretary was hugely important, was the growth of services we're going to deliver through the NHS app, and how we use that to then connect into mental health apps and other support that can be very targeted to people. I think there's big opportunities there. So working with health colleagues, and if there's some specific schemes that we can target in a data-driven way, I'd be very interested to follow that up.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Rosie. Harry, water.
Thanks very much. Secretary of State, look, Defra's updated the insolvency legislation. You've announced that you would block bonuses for water companies that are regularly in breach of the laws protecting our rivers and seas. I think all of us were gobsmacked, I think is probably the word, to find that £26 million had been given in bonuses to the directors and chief executives of water companies in the past 5 years. £26 million of bonuses, and I think we would commend your efforts to curtail those bonuses where they're not performing. So to start on a very positive note, We recognise that. Do you share Ofwat's view that proposals to raise customer bills by 70% by 2030 are unaffordable for most people? And how do you think we can balance what is the much needed financing of investment in water in this country and the infrastructure that's required with the affordability for the public?
Well, I think it's a hugely important area. I think I would disaggregate two different things. I think there's first, which is commitments the water companies have already made that are within the current 5-year plan that too often they're not meeting. And on those, I do think, particularly given that these are in essence monopoly businesses, where they're not competing to customers in the normal way, then I am very keen to ensure we hold the water companies to account. And I've been clear on that, and that is why we're massively increasing the number of inspections. So whilst we've stopped the unannounced inspections on farms, I take the opposite view with the water companies. So we're increasing unannounced inspections. We're having a 4-fold increase in inspections to address this concern that the likes of Panorama raised around companies marking their own homework.
I understand it's a 470% increase that you've announced. Can I just check, have you also announced the money and the resources to go with it?
Yes.
You have. And where does that money come from? Is it new money or is it money that's been taken from another part of the budget?
We'll reprioritise to make sure that we're funding that.
From where?
Well, within the department budget. So it is something that we've reprioritised.
Can we be more specific? Is it from other aspects of the EA's budget and water and where are we?
It's not from
we're not robbing Peter to pay Paul.
It.
So whom are we robbing? Whom are we deprioritising is always the question, isn't it?
We've been able to find that. We've been able to find that money from within the budget.
Okay, I'm not.
Well,
I recognise a stone wall when I see it.
No, quite the opposite, Mr. Gardner. Quite the opposite. So, firstly, if your concern is we're robbing Peter to pay Paul within the Environment Agency, no.
Yep,
so this is additional money for the Environment Agency. Point one. Point two. Within any department budget, and as a former Chief Secretary, you'd expect me to say this: there are programmes that are underspent. There are other programmes where you may want to sort of tweak the prioritisation.
I'm not going to press you further.
That's that. So,
I'm happy that you're doing it, Secretary.
But the point is we're doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy that you're doing it. Look, let's come to what is the really serious and very difficult problem that you face, and that we all face. Actually, 25% of all customers in England are going to face, and that is the future of Thames Water and Kemble Water as its holding company. We're looking at a situation where there's a possible special administration, and there are perhaps 3 possible outcomes. Sale, which is most likely, nationalisation, which is possible, or perhaps more innovatively, it could lead to an IPO and a refloated Thames Water. Now, we're talking about a regulatory capital value here of about 19 billion. It's possible that current shareholders and creditors could agree a restructuring, but not certain. And a special administration is likely to end in the sale of the business, which would probably be to a similar consortium of investors. But then that would risk ending up with the same problems as currently, namely poor governance, limited transparency, and recourse to shareholders for more equity would be in the hands of a very small number of funds. So how do you propose to deal with what I think all of us would recognise is a very difficult situation? In effect, you will recall that the chair of Kemble Water Holdings and Thames Water, who I understand has now resigned, came before this committee a few months ago and said that they would be able to meet the restructuring of the debt before April. You will know that Ofwat said that it would not allow dividends to be paid out. But of course, since then, the company has paid what is in effect a dividend to the holding company of several million. It's a very big mess, and I think everybody wants to know what plans your department has to transition this company to a future where it can function in the way that we all want it to see.
Well, let me pick up the specific question around Thames, but also to your earlier question around impact on consumer bills and the wider pressure for the industry. So I think in terms of Thames, obviously there is new management that has come in place. It is for shareholders to put in the equity that is required. What we have done in government is put in the legislation for a SARS regime as a insurance if that is required. But it is really an issue for the shareholders and the new management team. I think in terms of the wider question around PR24 and the impact on consumer bills, then clearly the business plans that were submitted are the opening pitch in terms of the investment those water companies feel is necessary. It's absolutely right, we have an independent regulator. It's right that we give that independent regulator the opportunity to fully scrutinise those plans. That is what Ofwat will do to ensure that they're efficient and customers are not paying twice for that investment. So that is a well-established process. That is something that they will do. And of course, it is the case that for new infrastructure, water companies can attract private investment. But that is all part of the determination that Ofwat will go through.
I'm not sure that you've charted a plan in what you've said. We're in a situation where you say, well, it's for the shareholders to come up with the additional investment in this company. But the very complex structure which this committee has challenged the chief executive and the chairman on before, has to a very large extent replicated what went on and what was condemned roundly on all sides under the Macquarie years, where effectively the Thames Water as a company was raided to boost the funds of Macquarie. A similar structure has happened with the Campbell Water Holding Company, even though this committee was assured on a number of occasions that that would never happen under their watch, there being the current chief executive, former finance director, actually a former director of Ofwat, and the chairman who's now resigned. And I think what we need to see from the department is a much clearer and structured way forward that could lead either to an IPO or perhaps a sale in which the government held a golden share. And I'm conscious that you will be reluctant to do anything in advance of April. One has to respect that because those are the deadlines for the capital that needs to be raised. And obviously it will be incredibly market sensitive. But nonetheless, I think you can indicate to this committee more clearly than you've been prepared to so far exactly how you see the options that are available to lead us forward.
So perhaps if I try and give some greater clarity, and then the Perm Sec may wish to add. So firstly, to reassure the committee that there is very regular engagement between not just the department, but the relevant areas, including Treasury and UKGI, with the relevant company. Secondly, as you yourself said, Mr. Garner, one has to be very mindful of the fact that there are market sensitivities around these things. Thirdly, it is for the company to come forward with the investment. And a fair challenge, fourthly, to us as ministers would be, had we taken steps in advance to put in place the legislative framework required, which, as I indicated, we had. So those things are happening, and I wouldn't want to sort of stray really beyond that, but perhaps...
Yeah, no, not huge amounts to add. Our confidence is that Ofwat are having the conversations that they should be having, as they would have with any company with which they have concerns, and they are doing that. And as there are a range of avenues, as you've discussed as well, that are open to the company to explore, and we've ensured that there is the contingency in place of the SAR, which has been placed for some time, but we ensured was updated, so we have that contingency in place. Okay. And I think more detailed conversation and pathways aren't so appropriate for a public conversation.
Let me try and skin this cat from the tail to the head rather than from the head to the tail. How do you, when you look at the way in which Ofwat has allowed this situation to develop over many years, and the way in which they have failed to use their powers, or perhaps have not had sufficient powers, at the same time to reprimand companies for their poor performance, whilst not endangering the viability of those companies by the penalties that they might impose. What are you then prompted to do in looking at Ofwat and the industry, the sector as a whole, and the regulation and the regulatory powers available in it? Because it seems to me that we've had what is in effect, whatever happens after April, we've had catastrophic failure. And that must have prompted the department to look very carefully not only at why that failure has taken place, but how it can be avoided in the future. And so far, we haven't had from the department that wholesale strategic restructuring plan for the control of the sector that one might have imagined.
So I think how I approach it is and of course there may be a debate people want to have as to past regulatory decisions and whether at a time of low interest rates before COVID, before the war in Ukraine, and some of the changes that flowed from that with and the amount of debt and so forth that was leveraged. Those are past discussions. As far as I'm concerned, it is important that the regulatory standards that are in place to protect water quality are enforced. These are statutory commitments. As part of that, we're putting in place the framework of the 470% increase in inspections linking to unlimited fines. So we have an independent process with the regulator. We need to respect that. What we are doing as a department is put in place a much more robust regulatory regime so that where there are serious criminal breaches, we hold those companies to account.
Yeah, but Secretary of State, you'll acknowledge that I understand entirely that you don't want to, you are not the regulator. What I'm saying is that in effect the regulatory regime has failed, and I welcome what you're doing at the other end to say when those failings manifest themselves in pollution events, you're going to tighten up on that. But that avoids the big strategic problem of why has the regulatory regime failed so badly and how you need to change that to make sure it operates properly.
As I say, we have an independent regulator. We're respecting that. I think we have put in place from a government point of view.
You can change its remit. You can do things to alter the way in which it regulates the industry.
Yes, and so one of the things I'm signalling is the importance of enforcing regulatory standards. Linked to that, we have a very clear plan, the plan for water that was set out by my predecessor last April.
Last year, yeah.
That sets out that there needs to be significant investment in terms of the infrastructure. There is a question then as to how much investment that is and how that is split between the private investment versus the impact on consumers. And that is what we have a process to work through.
I'll leave it there, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. I suppose the question that most citizens want to know is, do you have a plan in every eventuality, and will the water keep coming out the taps and sewage keep getting treated?
Yes.
And so I think that's probably...
yes and yes.
Yeah. Selene, I think you've got a point about...
Thank you. Thank you. On,
we saved the best till last.
Thank you. On a slightly more niche area initially, on just coastal bathing waters, and I am going to declare a mild interest that I do surf badly and was in on Sunday. But I'm wondering if you could perhaps detail what is actually going to be done to increase the monitoring of our bathing waters along the coast, and particularly linked to storm overflows. As during the winter months, there is no testing taking place on a regular basis. That means there's no actual data. We have data from the water company, and you're advised not to enter the water for one full tidal rotation afterwards, which is 13 hours. Then we have campaign groups that advise that we have a sewage alert without any data being collected, any testing taking place, and they hold that sewage alert in place for 48 hours, so 4 times the length of the Environment Agency's recommendation. What is going to be done to address this? Because it is decimating tourism areas and terrifying people in an area where actually many beaches, but my own constituency, we have outstanding water quality, and therefore I just wondered what was going to be done to address this data situation.
Well, first, if I may, just to pay tribute to the work that you've done, because I know this is something you've hugely championed, and I think that has had an effect, certainly when I see the discussions, and I think very much brought this to the fore. And of course, I think there's a slight distinction when we're talking about this issue. What gets conflated is, in terms of beaches, it tends to be more the risk around sewage, and in terms of rivers, often the impact of farming and some of the changes that we're making around slurry storage, mini anaerobic digesters, buffer strips and so forth. When I look at the likes of the River Wye are particularly important there when dealing with the likes of the chicken litter and so forth. So the risk isn't the same everywhere in terms of bathing. There is also a paradox, as you touched on in your question. The more transparency we brought through the data, to some extent, the more that triggers... it brings very good scrutiny, but sometimes that data can be misinterpreted or exacerbated. So we are bringing more transparency, we are bringing more data through. There's a significant amount of work, as you know, on storm overflows. Part of the reason for the plan for water and the wider investment with PR24 is how we raise the game of the water companies in terms of their regulatory obligations. And then the big thrust of the announcements we made at the Oxford Farming Conference and with the NFU is how do we create the incentives within the farming sector to improve the risk of runoff that we see. And that's why we've got this package of grants, and particularly slurry, where we've seen a doubling of the grants.
I very much appreciate the work that has gone on within this space, but are there any plans to tackle a sewage alert that has no definition in science, and having asked the Parliamentary Library, no definition at all, which is allowed to be issued along our beaches without anyone knowing what's actually coming out of the pipe? I mean, obviously, in an ideal world, we'd know what came out of the pipe, but we do need more regular testing of that water so that we can say with certainty that you can enter it. Is there a plan to actually bring that forward?
Well, it is something that the Minister for Water, I know, is personally very engaged on, not least, I think before he joined the department, in his constituency capacity, he championed a bathing water scheme in his own constituency.
Luckily.
Indeed. And you'll have also seen the recent announcement we made in areas like Harrogate and some nearer to you, Sir Robert, around bathing water. So it is something that I know the Minister for Water is looking at, and what I would suggest is I'd perhaps ask him to drop you an update in terms of where the thinking's got to.
Thank you. Because I think that obviously is a freshwater scheme, whereas obviously when you've got saltwater, it behaves very differently when some of these pollutants hit it. But I think the one thing that hopefully we do all agree on, that with the extreme rainfall this winter, that it eventually, unless we put tanks right the way around the coast, it is going to get into the sea, whether it comes out of an overflow pipe or comes from a river onto a beach. And I think, there is a concern that obviously we've had a huge amount of emphasis on just one pollutant, and I'm glad to hear you touch on slurry, but that as we tackle those combined storm overflows, when it rains, that water is still heading to the sea. And what the data is initially showing is that some of the streams running onto beaches are actually more polluted than what is coming out of the overflows. And so will there be, as we tackle the overflow situation, a focus on that bathing water quality, not just on stopping the overflows, because actually stopping the overflows may actually make the bathing water quality perversely worse?
Yeah, so I think my understanding from the Minister of Water is looking very actively at that. I know there's also an issue around the impact on runoff from our highways network, so I've asked officials to engage with the Department for Transport more actively on that. So there's the role of the water companies, there's a role of farming, but there's also other factors at play. I think it's right we have more transparency, but we've seen a significant increase in the interest in bathing waters, and we need to ensure that the policy reflects that.
Thank you. And so moving on from there sort of into the area of flooding, which is obviously in many ways very closely related. And I think one of the hopes, looking at some of the work that has gone on locally to my own constituency, is that we've taken a whole catchment area approach. And I wonder, obviously, when you have the sea just down there, you don't flood in quite the same way as other places. But what steps are you taking to encourage more investment into natural flood management and sustainable drainage and sort of whole catchment approaches to deliver property flood resilience measures at an individual and a community level?
Well, a huge amount of work's going on with that, not least from the Minister for Nature, so our landscape recovery schemes, looking at a catchment approach. I mentioned the River Wye a moment ago, and we've been looking at that again from a catchment point of view. I think there's a question around catchment champions and having people that can help facilitate amongst the various stakeholders within a catchment. And as I've touched on, it's looking at the different factors that are at play, and it's bringing our nature work together. So, for example, where a waterway has been straightened, putting some bends in it is one of the things which slows the flow down. Obviously, upstream, there's work with our tree planting and environmental schemes that can bring flood prevention benefits. So there's no one single approach, but it's bringing the wider portfolio of the department to bear, given that flooding is obviously devastating for the communities concerned. It's bad for the bathing water, it's causing huge problems within the farming community, but it's hugely damaging to nature as well, because often it's the bird nesting sites and others that get flooded there. So it is a key area of focus.
Thank you. And so ELMS is obviously one of those ways of incentivising landowners to provide those natural flood management systems. But are there going to be changes within that scheme and adapt it to make sure it covers urban as well as rural communities so that it better protects both?
One of the things we announced at the Oxford Farming Conference was 50 new actions under SFI. I think that indicates our willingness to look at schemes and to flex them. So within ELMS, as I say, I think there's already a huge amount that we're doing around local nature schemes, landscape recovery. I was down in Kent looking at short stream restoration and those sort of issues. So there's a lot already happening within the nature space, and many of those are already looking at flood prevention as one of the benefits, but always open to looking to see what else can be done.
Thank you. And moving into the urban environment, urban green infrastructure obviously can be a great support for flood mitigation. Is that something that's being prioritised within the department, and how?
Probably the most important thing which we're very much talking with DLUC colleagues, and it's in the plan for water from last April, is what more we can do around new housing development and the grey water from those. And we're at advanced stage of our discussions with DLUC on that. But then there's also sort of fairly straightforward things. So that, again, Parliament's debated in the past wet wipes and what more we can do on there. So again, there's a range of issues in terms of how we take action which has an impact within urban areas but actually benefits downstream when it goes into the sea.
That's just sad. I mean, there's just a whole range of measures that we're taking on surface water flooding, which is the responsibility of local authorities, but very much the Environment Agency and the department playing a role in supporting that. And we have made improvements so that they can access partnership funding for some of the surface water schemes, better kind of risk mapping so you can tell when surface water flooding might happen, and better forecasting, better maps. So the whole range of things to support on improving the support on surface water flooding.
Thank you. And so whilst many areas of England have had access to the flooding recovery framework, some areas where it has not been activated, such as Yorkshire, or that exist across local authority boundaries, are still suffering. Do you think that the criteria for activating this network are fully working, and are you going to be assessing the overall effectiveness of the scheme?
Well, I think firstly, whenever, particularly given the extent of flooding we've had, and I know as a constituency MP, there's parts of the constituency that have got surface water on that, in my 14 years, I've never seen water in those places. I was very struck, as was the Minister for Water, when I went up to Lincolnshire after the flooding, just how extensive that had been, and particularly damaging within the farming sector. So of course, we keep these issues under review. I think the key focus for me was to get speed into our response, and I think people were kind enough to recognise that the announcement of the sport came out very quickly from Defra, and I think that's a tribute to the officials that were working with the Environment Agency at real pace to get a quick response out. Of course, often wherever one draws the boundary, there's often a desire to slightly stretch that a little further, but I think it was particularly beneficial this year that we got the response out so quickly to give people the comfort that, particularly for uninsured losses, that there was some provision available.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed. I think Neil had a quick
supplementary on flooding. I represent an area that frequently floods, and the government is very good in terms of prevention and the response when floods happen, in terms of the Environment Agency, the emergency services, councils, volunteer groups. But touching on points that have been made about mental health implications of flooding, both the anxiety of communities worrying about being flooded, whether that's in urban areas or whether that's farmers as well, but also the trauma when the flood comes. And one of the things that we found in our mental health inquiry and in previous flooding inquiries, that communities are looked after in the immediate term, but the minute the blue lights leave and the waters subside, communities are then left to fend for themselves. So is that something that you are looking at cross-government, what we can do to support these frequently flooded communities to help them move forward?
Well, I mean, there is specific funding for frequently flooded communities, firstly, but I think secondly, as part of the wider capital programme, the 5.2 billion that the Environment Agency has, the areas that I'm looking at is how do we streamline the approvals process in terms of those schemes? How do we better use modern methods of construction? How do we better leverage partnership funding? Are we using technology around computer simulations and things to predict the flows of water and how that varies? Again, speaking in a constituency capacity, I was always struck at the advanced modelling that the Dutch had around their flood risk and some of the lessons we can learn there. And equally, in terms of just streamlining our approach, I went up to one area where every year they put in temporary barriers. And when I said, well, why is it railings and not a wall? It was because the local authority didn't want to replace the railings. So we put temporary barriers up there. Because aesthetically they thought that was in keeping historically with the town landscape, when actually a wall would have provided a much better solution. So I think as climate change puts greater pressure on our flood defences, we're rolling out the capital programme, but I think there's scope for us to look at that partnership funding, the streamlining, the use of technology, and perhaps then take stakeholders with us on some of the changes they need to make.
Just quickly, you've held a number of portfolios, but as Health Secretary and Cabinet Office, cross-government working in terms of supporting the mental health of the people that have been flooded as well. Is that something that can be looked at cross-government to support these communities? Yes, with technology and things like that, but supporting the people. That's one of the things that we've been looking at as a committee.
Well, of course, and I think part of the reason the Prime Minister announced the money for mental health charities was looking at that specifically. That was directed at farming charities. I think obviously flooding, by its nature, if it floods our houses, it's not just those that are working in farming, it can flood lots of stakeholders, and therefore there is a role for DLUC colleagues in terms of how they're supporting those communities and what information we're giving people and what level of net funds are available.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Secretary, you mentioned, I was very pleased to hear you mention grey water harvesting, which seems to have been sort of the poor relation of measures you can take to improve the environmental performance of a property. Would you agree with me that one of the problems is that clean water is metered into housing, but sewage isn't metered out? So if there were to be new developments with a lot of grey water harvesting, will there need to be a conversation with the Yorkshire Water and other companies around the country to determine how you would then meter the clean water in, given that basically you're maybe reducing the water bill but not reducing the sewage treatment capacity need?
I think I'd have to look at the detail of it. I think the wider point, I think, is that as what people always used to talk to me in the Treasury more about is dealing with the stock than the flow, but at least on a problem with the new housing, I think where we can take measures to avoid exacerbating that, then we should be looking very actively at that, and that's the discussion we're having with DLUC colleagues, and that is in the plan for water, so that's not a new thing, that's something that government's already signalled. I think more generally, it's about a range of measures. So we've not touched on, for example, on-farm reservoirs, but I think they have a hugely important role to play. We've not talked about drainage boards. Now, they're not universal, but in certain parts of the country, they're extremely important. And the Minister for Waters announced 75 million of funding for next year for drainage boards. That's particularly an issue within areas like Lincolnshire, but also Somerset and elsewhere. So I think there's a range of measures, but I just wanted to signal that the point in the plan for water around new development hadn't been lost, and it is something that we're talking to DLUC about.
And finally, obviously your department and its agencies have contracts with various organisations to provide them with goods and services. And I'm sure you'd agree with me that companies that show honesty and integrity in the way they conduct business will be the sort of companies you deal with. Obviously, following the Horizon Post Office scandal, we've seen, I think, behaviour by Fujitsu, who are running the Horizon computer system, being exposed for what it is. I mean, do you share concerns that the recent contract that was extended for the Environment Agency was something that might sort of raise a few eyebrows?
So Robert, I'm not particularly cited on that extension that PermSec wants to come in, but of course, my primary focus is, the Post Office scandal is something that shocked us all in Parliament, hasn't it? And I think we've all been, found it deeply disturbing to see the distress that it caused. I'm not particularly cited on that.
There's been a ban on all new government contracts with Fujitsu, and this is an extension of an existing contract, I think. Is that right?
It's an extension, I think, happened, relatively recently. There isn't a sort of government requirement to not contract with Fujitsu, and it is quite a large contract, but obviously we keep all of these things under review.
Mm-hmm. I think part of the question, but let me take it away and come back. Part of the question is always how quickly one can transition, given the other priorities we have within the Environment Agency, particularly on flood protection. It is not always the case that one can just simply lift and drop from one major supplier to the other. So one would want to understand to what extent the board has considered alternatives and to what extent that is practical, given however deeply ingrained that IT system is into their operational delivery. But perhaps with the PermSec, we can come back to you on that.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Permanent Secretary of State. I think it's fair to say you've actually answered our questions, which can't always be said following these sessions. So thank you very much indeed for coming along and being so well briefed and honest with us on a number of issues. We appreciate that. Order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.